When a narcissistic woman suddenly becomes silent, many people mistake that quiet for emotional withdrawal or inner peace. But this is not the silence of detachment, it is the silence of strategy. In psychological terms, absence can be far more powerful than presence. Carl Jung often spoke about how the psyche abhors a vacuum. When something meaningful disappears without closure, the mind rushes in to fill the gap. That is precisely what this silence is designed to provoke. It is not meant to end connection, but to move it entirely into your inner world. Notice how this silence feels different from genuine distance. There is no clear boundary, no sense of finality. Instead, it leaves you suspended, wondering, interpreting, replaying past conversations. This is intentional. By removing herself outwardly, she amplifies her presence inwardly. The unanswered questions become hooks, and your imagination does the work she no longer has to do. You begin to supply the meaning, the longing, even the hope, without her lifting a finger. From a Jungian perspective, she positions herself as an unresolved symbol in your psyche. The unconscious seeks completion, integration, resolution. When something remains unfinished, it gains disproportionate power. Her silence becomes an archetypal absence, one that quietly demands your attention. You may tell yourself you are strong, rational, detached, but the psyche does not respond to logic alone. It responds to tension, mystery, and emotional ambiguity. This is why the urge to reach out grows stronger over time. Not because the bond was healthy, but because it was never properly closed. Strategic silence keeps the dynamic alive while shifting the burden onto you. If you break the silence, she regains control without having risked vulnerability, rejection, or accountability. The power imbalance quietly resets itself. Understanding this changes everything. Silence no longer feels romantic or meaningful. It reveals itself as a psychological maneuver. And the moment you see it clearly, its power begins to fade. Because true strength is not proven by who speaks first, but by who no longer needs the silence to end in order to move forward. Another subtle but powerful sign appears in what she leaves behind, rather than in what she takes away. A narcissistic woman rarely disappears cleanly. Instead, she plants psychological anchors, small, seemingly insignificant remnants that keep her alive in your inner world. An unfinished conversation, a familiar phrase, a shared memory left unresolved, even a final message that feels incomplete. These are not accidents, they are fragments designed to linger, because the mind is far more attached to what remains unfinished than to what is clearly concluded. Carl Jung spoke extensively about the psyche's need for wholeness. When an experience is left open-ended, it does not fade, it circulates. It returns in thoughts, dreams, and emotional impulses. By leaving these anchors behind, she ensures that the relationship continues internally, even while it appears externally paused. You may believe you are moving on, yet part of your psychic energy is still orbiting something unresolved. What makes this particularly effective is that these anchors often feel personal and meaningful. They don't scream manipulation, they whisper familiarity. A memory resurfaces at the wrong moment. A song, a place, a phrase suddenly pulls you backward. The unconscious does not distinguish between presence and symbolic presence. As long as the symbol remains active, the bond remains alive. Psychologically, this places you in a subtle state of suspension. You are not fully attached, but not fully free. And in that liminal space, the urge to reach out grows, not out of weakness, but out of a natural human desire for completion. The psyche seeks to close loops, to resolve tension, to integrate experience. Reaching out feels like the path toward relief, even when reason warns otherwise. This is how control is maintained without direct contact. She does not chase, she waits. The anchors do the work for her, and the longer they remain unexamined, the more power they quietly hold over your decisions. The moment you recognize these anchors for what they are, they lose their unconscious grip. What was once a pull becomes a pattern, and patterns can be broken, because freedom does not come from erasing memory, but from reclaiming authorship over its meaning. Another behavior that often goes unnoticed is her ability to remain present without being visible. She watches without appearing to watch. There is no direct message, no obvious attempt to reconnect, yet there are signs of quiet observation, social media views, subtle online activity, indirect updates through mutual acquaintances. This form of distance is not absence, it is surveillance without exposure. Psychologically, it allows her to stay informed while maintaining the illusion of detachment. From a Jungian standpoint, this reflects a deep need for control without vulnerability. To observe without being seen preserves the ego. It protects her from rejection while still feeding the sense of relevance and importance. She knows what you are doing, how you are coping, whether you seem stable or unsettled. This information is power, and power in this dynamic is never surrendered willingly. What makes this particularly destabilizing is that you can often feel it without being able to prove it. There is a vague sense of being watched, of still being known. The psyche responds strongly to this ambiguity. You may begin to self-correct, to perform stability, or to wonder whether your silence is being noticed. Even without contact, the relational field remains active. Jung would describe this as a psychic connection sustained by projection rather than interaction. This passive monitoring also reinforces her expectation that you will reach out first. By watching quietly, she avoids breaking the silence while still tracking the moment you weaken, doubt, or grow nostalgic. If you reach out, it confirms her internal narrative, that she was never abandoned, only temporarily distanced. Her waiting is validated, and the power dynamic resets without her having risked anything. Understanding this changes how you interpret her stillness. It is not indifference, it is restraint. And restraint in this context is strategic. Once you see that the gaze exists even without contact, you stop mistaking her quiet for emotional absence. And this awareness returns the power to where it belongs. Because the moment you stop performing for an unseen audience, the observer loses relevance. True detachment begins not when they stop watching, but when you no longer live as if you are being watched at all. Another layer of this dynamic unfolds not in her actions, but in the private story she tells herself. A narcissistic woman does not experience distance the way most people do. Silence is not interpreted as loss, but as misalignment, something temporary, something that will correct itself. Internally, she rewrites the narrative in a way that protects her self-image. In this story, she remains the central figure, the prize, the one whose absence must eventually be felt and remedied by you. Carl Jung understood that the ego will distort reality to preserve its sense of coherence and superiority. When faced with separation, rather than questioning her role in the breakdown, she reframes the situation as a test or a phase. Your silence becomes confusion, emotional immaturity, or resistance, not a conscious choice to detach. This cognitive restructuring allows her to wait without confronting rejection. After all, in her inner world, rejection has not occurred. This internal narrative quietly justifies inaction. If she believes your return is inevitable, there is no need to pursue, apologize, or reflect. Waiting becomes a position of strength rather than passivity. The longer the silence lasts, the more meaningful your eventual outreach becomes in her mind. It confirms not only her desirability, but the accuracy of the story she has been telling herself all along. Psychologically, this is how expectation turns into entitlement. The mind begins to assume outcomes as facts, and when that assumption goes unchallenged, it solidifies. She may genuinely feel surprised or even offended if you do not reach out, not because of attachment, but because reality has failed to align with her internal script. For you, this understanding is crucial. It explains why there is often no closure, no acknowledgement, no repair. In her narrative, none of that is necessary. The relationship has not ended. It has simply paused, awaiting your return to restore the familiar dynamic. The power of this insight lies in recognizing that you are not obligated to fulfill a story you did not write. When you refuse to step back into a role assigned by someone else as ego, you reclaim authorship over your own psychological reality. And that choice, quiet, firm, and self-directed, is where true freedom begins. Time plays a very different role in this dynamic than most people expect. For a narcissistic woman, time is not something that weakens attachment or softens emotion. It is something she believes works in her favor. While others see distance as a space for healing or reflection, she often sees it as a slow, invisible force that will eventually bend you back toward her. In her mind, time does not erase significance, it magnifies it. Carl Jung spoke of how the unconscious is largely untouched by linear time. What is emotionally charged does not age the way logic does. By relying on time, she assumes that unresolved feelings will deepen, that nostalgia will grow stronger than clarity, and that loneliness will quietly undo your resolve. This belief allows her to remain inactive while still feeling powerful. She is not waiting passively, she is waiting confidently, convinced that emotional gravity will do the work for her. This is why there is no urgency to repair, to apologize, or to reconnect openly. Time itself becomes the weapon. Every day that passes without closure is, in her view, another day. The bond embeds itself deeper in your psyche. She assumes that eventually you will want relief from the tension, from the unanswered questions, from the weight of unfinished emotion. And when that moment arrives, reaching out will feel like your idea, not her strategy. Psychologically, this is a dangerous illusion. Time only amplifies what is repeatedly revisited. If clarity grows instead of longing, time weakens her position. If awareness replaces fantasy, time dissolves the emotional charge. The difference lies not in the passage of days, but in what happens within the psyche during that passage. Understanding this reframes your experience of waiting. Time is no longer an enemy you must endure, or a force working against you. It becomes neutral, something shaped by attention, intention, and insight. The moment you stop feeding the unresolved narrative, time stops serving her and starts serving you. And this is the turning point. Because time does not decide who regains control, consciousness does. When you use distance to gain clarity rather than longing, waiting loses its power, and with it, the illusion that time was ever on her side at all. At the deepest level, what she is waiting for has very little to do with connection, and almost everything to do with control. A narcissistic woman does not experience relationships as mutual exchanges of presence and vulnerability. She experiences them as hierarchies of emotional power. When contact breaks, the imbalance feels threatened. And so the waiting begins, not for reconciliation, but for you to restore the familiar structure by reaching out first. Carl Jung understood power not merely as dominance, but as psychic positioning. Whoever initiates, explains, seeks, or repairs unconsciously places themselves in the lower position. By remaining silent, she avoids this role entirely. She waits for you to move toward her, because that movement confirms the old dynamic. She withholds, you pursue, she evaluates, you seek approval. Your outreach is not just communication, it is symbolic submission within the psychological order she prefers. This is why reaching out often feels strangely unsatisfying once it happens. The moment contact is restored, the imbalance reappears. The warmth you expected is delayed, conditional, or inconsistent. Control has been regained, not intimacy. And yet, from her perspective, the goal has been achieved. The hierarchy is intact again, and the tension dissolves in her favor. What keeps this pattern alive is not affection, but conditioning. Over time, the psyche associates relief with surrendering position. You learn unconsciously that peace comes when you lower yourself. Jung would describe this as a shadow dynamic, where parts of your self-respect are sacrificed to avoid inner discomfort. The cost is subtle, but cumulative. Seeing this clearly is unsettling, but also liberating. It reveals that the urge to reach out is not always a call of the heart. Often, it is a pull toward an old structure where your worth had to be proven. Once you understand that, you can choose differently. Because real power does not come from restoring an imbalance. It comes from refusing to participate in one. And the moment you stop trying to reclaim connection by giving up your position, the entire dynamic collapses. What remains is a simple truth. Anyone who needs you to lower yourself in order to feel powerful was never offering you connection in the first place.